your and the third image is someone that actually does. And so if you'd all give a very warm welcome to Rachel Stevens.
All right. Now is my audio working? All right. There we go. All right. Hi, everyone. Rachel Stevens. I work at Red Monk. Today we're talking about Aristotle and infomercials. So I'm really excited. I'm going to talk today. I know Ben promised no ethics talks, so sorry. But we're going to talk about building business and ethical cases around accessibility, using some examples that we may know and maybe some examples that you haven't thought of yet. So I'm going to start with a few promises. Like one, not all of my slides are this garish. Two, I know that there's maybe a little bit of concern about ethics as a boring or kind of esoteric subject. And so we're not going to get into like the thousands and thousands of years of ethical debates around how everything works. Instead, we're just going to talk about some core questions that you can be asking yourselves in your business that kind of pull from the best of the different ethical philosophies. So we're not going to get too deep in the weeds. So that's my other promise. And then my third promise is that I have an MBA, but I promise I won't talk too much about all of the businessy things, although there will be at least a few references to spreadsheets because it's me. So that's kind of where we're going. I think that it's clear to make it clear up front that I think accessibility and inclusion is something that is morally sound, and I also think that it makes sense as a business priority. So I think we'll start on the business angle, and if you think about the social model of disability, I think it's a very great framework to think about all areas of accessibility using this framework. So we have things like physical ability, or age, or gender, your language, your geographic location can all impact how people and your users, kind of their perspectives and their experiences on how they engage with your product. And if you think about this social model of disability as a framework, it's really great because it doesn't emphasize the underlying condition, but rather it focuses on how we can consider the various elements of how a person's situation causes them to interact with the environment around them. So that's kind of the framework we're going to use. You might see disability come up a little bit more just because I like this framework, but I do mean all forms of inclusivity and accessibility. And so the goal is to focus on removing environmental and social barriers for our products. And this, again, not to say that there aren't niche solutions or specialized products that can make a big difference for people who need accessible solutions, but this talk's going to go a little bit more meta, as James likes to say. So we're going to talk about how we can make holistically better products and address a wider target market. And as James talked about earlier, it's inclusive design. This is the concept of inclusive design, is removing those environmental and social barriers. And James, sorry, I'm going to stop talking about James. He talked about the Microsoft Inclusive Design Kit. And so this is the example that James talked about, is the different varieties of conditions that can impact how somebody is interacting with the environment. There's a range. So when we're saying that we're making things available to a broader group of people, it's not just people who have permanent constraints, but there's also many of us at any given time are going to have either temporary or situational constraints that can impact how we interact with the world around us. And this is kind of just an excuse to have my baby up on stage. But we are new parents, and for probably the first few months of my child's life, the only way that we watched television at home was through closed captioning, because we just couldn't have the volume on the television without risking waking her up. And we've had other examples. I think one that's perhaps pertinent here is that I love BBC dramas, but I'm terrible at understanding everyone's regional accents. So closed captioning is what brings BBC to Colorado. And I think the other one pertinent to right now is last time James had me up on stage, I gave my 20-minute talk in 12 minutes because I was so nervous I talked so fast. So if I start flying right over there. And we just had a lovely talk about curb cuts. And so I think just to build on that is like when we think about how accessibility can broaden our target market, it's not just that it can make our products accessible to more people, but it can also change the impact of our product for more people. So we can create a different value proposition across the board. And I think that I will let the curb cut talk stand on its own and we'll keep going, but I did want to point out this paper from Stephen Jacobs I thought was lovely because it was written in 1999, and he lists the benefits of curb cuts as pushing strollers, riding skateboards, and using rollerblades, which I think is like the best thing about the 90s is that we were worried about the welfare of rollerblade users. I think that's just delightful. So anyways, but everybody can benefit from curb cuts. And we can make better products when we worry about accessibility for the few impacting the many. So another great example of that impact is infomercials. So we can design something explicitly for a mass market, but it can have an outsized impact on a subset of our target market. And I think infomercials, if you're not familiar with infomercials, it's like if you're up at like 1 o'clock in the morning and you have a really melodramatically acted like 30-minute ad, that's an infomercial. And they're usually designed to be products of convenience for a mass market. And they tend to be something that is not instinctively evident to be applicable to people with disabilities, but it can actually make a really big difference. Some of the products, I'm not sure ShamWow is going to make a huge difference, but some of the products, like this laptop, are designed so that you can have convenient cooking at home by, instead of using a knife, just kind of whacking like a chopper on your counter, which is great if you have fine motor limitations and you want to prepare your own meals at home. Or there's plenty of products that are designed like the Touch and Brush or the Tap Magic, which are primarily marketed towards making sure your kids aren't spilling all over your house, which is a great thing, but is also great for independent living for people who have mobility issues or who have reduced stability. And the Snuggie is, well, it was not designed to be this, but can be great for people in wheelchairs who need their arms available, but can also have just added warmth and an extra layer. So when we think about measuring impact, we need to remember that the impact may be disparate across different audiences, and that the level of impact can be very substantial. And so like for what may be a small convenience for some, or something that doesn't seem like it's a necessary invention, can actually be a huge provider of utility and independence and dignity for other populations. So I think when we talked about the curb cut effect, it really felt like it was lots of rainbows and butterflies, but we don't live in a perfect world. If we did, every dress would have pockets. But not all of the examples are simple, especially as we build business cases, because there's going to be costs and trade-offs and things that we have to consider that are maybe a little bit harder to reason through. I think probably most of us are most familiar with money and time as those externalities, but there are a lot of different things that can actually come up as you start to think about things. So if you're going through a sprint cycle and you are choosing between certain features, that might be an opportunity cost that you're thinking about. The ones that I want to focus over here are on the right, though, with the competing values, because I think that's where we really need to have ethics start to play into our decision making. So one example that came up a few years ago, and then again came up last year when everyone had the outcry over plastic straws, but the pre-peeled oranges was the first one I saw of social media getting up in arms about environmental waste, and that's fair. It's a good cause that we want to be environmentally conscious, and we want to take care of our planet, and we don't want to waste when we don't have to. But I think that it is a little bit hard to have that empathy to step back and see this isn't just waste, but it's actually something that can make a big difference for people. But then how do we start thinking about those trade-offs? Is it a trade-off? Is there a way that we can have both? Can we mitigate the impact of providing a product and not have externalities to others? Or is it something where we can weigh the impacts out? And how do we weigh impacts when it's, sorry, apples and oranges? I was really excited about that pun. But how do we start thinking about different needs for different groups, and how do we weigh our own values? And another example about this that I thought was interesting, this is a tweet from the former CTO of Facebook, and he kind of laid out this trade-off that tech companies make, is how do you both follow laws and think about global human rights and issues? How do you have a global framework for how you approach and act about things? And one of the things that I thought was an interesting one that was recently applied was Slack pulling users who, in an attempt to apply with American sanctions against Iran. It was questionably handled in the way that they did it, but it surfaced some broader questions. What if you're a community that is based in the UK and you don't have to apply those sanction laws, and all of a sudden part of your community is now cut off based off of a legal system that doesn't actually apply to you, and you have that? What if you're running an open source community and now you don't have users with access for things that maybe don't even apply to your legal situation? Or if you're an open core project, I've talked to one, how do you weigh the inclusivity of talking and reaching to your broader community around you who now have questionable access or more difficult access with the, like, do you want to set up a parallel IRC server so that everybody can reach your organization, knowing that that's going to add overhead complexity and cost, and it's going to require headcount? Like, so there are trade-offs that happen that are a little bit trickier to try to start navigating. And I think that when we think about inclusivity, we have to think about not only the curb cut effect in terms of trying to make our products more inclusive, but we also have to think about how people need to talk about inclusivity, because it's a little bit hard to figure out what to be empathetic about and how to surface your concerns. So step one, I just wanted to run through some ways to think about business cases. Inclusivity starts with who you're involving. And this might be specific people within your company who have specific needs. It could be departments, depending on what your situation is. Is it product or engineering? Is it legal? Is it marketing and communications? Depending on what kind of trade-offs you're making, it can be a very disparate group that you need to get involved. But I think if you start thinking about that holistically, earlier on, you're going to do a better job of trying to figure out what the concerns are and how you need to handle them. And then there's this concept called RACI, which is what level of involvement do people need to have? Do they need to be responsible for things, accountable, consulted, informed? So thinking about how you actually communicate, when you communicate, and with whom you're communicating is the first step for organizational accessibility. I think a lot of us in the business world have our big spreadsheets of risk assessment. We go through and we try to write down the type of the risk and the likelihood of the risk and the severity of the risk, and we multiply everything together with different factors and we score it all out. My question then is, have you considered inclusivity and accessibility in those assessments? Have you started thinking about those trade-offs? Have you thought about the cost of action and the cost of inaction? I think inaction in particular is an area that we tend to overlook when we start filling things out. So it's trying to consider not only how we're talking about accessibility, but starting to put it into the frameworks that are common for our business decision makers, because it's the reality of the world that we live in is that, maybe it's just the reality of the world I live in, but things happen in Excel. And so you have to be able to start thinking not just in the terms of the ethics and the morals of the world you want to live in, but you actually have to be able to articulate it in a way that makes sense to the business decision makers and leaders in your organization. That said, it's a mistake to approach ethical problems exclusively quantitatively, because metrics are going to be a key element of your business case, but they're going to be fuzzy at best. Things are going to be hard to, your target market's going to have indirect audiences. You're going to have impacts that are hard to measure, and you're going to have trade-offs that are going to be not easy to compare one to another. And so if accessibility is the right and moral thing to do, and you have a business that is designed on coming up with metrics and quantitative measurements, how do we figure that all out? How do we fit into a world where not everything can be done in a spreadsheet? And I think the key way to start thinking about this is to start asking ourselves questions. So we're not going to have easy conversations, but I think if we start thinking through the different ethical frameworks and choosing the ones that make sense, every ethical framework has both pros and cons. And I think that rather than trying to weigh yourself down in what you need to do to be, you don't need an ethics or a philosophy degree to start thinking ethically. What you need to do is start asking yourselves questions and understanding that there's going to be trade-offs, understanding that the conversation will be messy and that people will have different points of view, and that you can reach different ethical conclusions as the person sitting next to you, and neither of you are necessarily wrong. You have different frameworks and different points of view, and then you have to talk those through and figure out what your priorities are. And so I think these are great questions to kind of get you started, and more frameworks. And I think that I'll post the link in the Slack channel, but there's a fabulous book called, well, now I'm forgetting it, but there's a fabulous book that I'll post too in the Slack channel that can help you start thinking through how to apply different ethical frameworks in a business setting, and just kind of some examples of how to walk through that. But I think the thing to remember is that for most people, the larger struggle is not whether or not to be ethical, but how to be ethical, or in some cases, not realizing that they haven't realized with empathy what other people's situation is, and are perhaps ignorant that they are not considering other people's point of view. So the struggle is not good versus evil most of the time. The struggle is usually varying degrees of good. And so if we think about that from an organizational perspective, it's, if you think of Google's mission statement, which is don't be evil, that's great, don't be evil. But at the same time, it's really, that doesn't provide concrete clarity for the people in your organization to figure out how to navigate these situations. So something that would be much more helpful is we're committed to these values for these reasons, and we prioritize in a meaningful way. And when I say meaningful way, I mean that you're tying people's pay to it. It needs to be something where it is not just something that is a nice to have, it is something that is actually part of your performance at the company, is behaving ethically. And the other thing is to articulate your organizational values, why you have them. And a lot of the times your organizational values are going to balance each other out. So there's something that happen holistically. So I think in engineering, a great example is if you value velocity in shipping, you also probably want to have values around either like quality or customer focus alongside of it. It's not just speed that happens, it's getting a better product to the customer as quickly as possible. So you don't want to have one or the other, you want all of them working in concert. And so I think having people understand how those values all work together and how it impacts how you want to build products is a great way, and that needs to come from the top. But I also think that it is something that we can start issuing within our own teams as we start to talk about product design. How do our product decisions actually tie in with our organizational values, and how do they tie in with our ethics? How do they tie in with who we want to be as people? I think that's the other thing to think about, is that people and organizational ethics are not, a personal value and an organizational value are not always the same thing. So how do you let people bring their whole self to work and also still have everybody moving in the same direction? I think these are all conversations that are hard, and we have to start having them, and we have to start having them transparently and honestly, because that's how we're actually going to start moving forward. And so I wanted to close with an Aristotle quote, which is, where we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence then is not an act, but a habit. So I think accessibility and inclusion is not some magical endpoint for your product design. It is a part of the process of your organization, and it needs to be part of your organizational decision making. And you need to include it as both an ethical consideration and also a business case. So that's Aristotle in a Snuggie. Okay. Thanks very much, everyone.